He thought humiliating her in his courtroom would be effortless, but he had no idea he was witnessing the final hour of his own authority. The courtroom in downtown Chicago carried its usual weight that morning. Polished oak benches filled with quiet observers, the American flag standing still in the corner, and the faint hum of whispered conversations dissolving into silence as Judge Daniel Whitmore adjusted his robe and glanced over the docket with practiced indifference. Then she stepped forward. Sarah Mitchell, plain gray blazer, worn leather folder in her hands. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, and yet something about her presence seemed to disturb the rhythm of the room in a way no one could quite explain. Whitmore barely looked at her before speaking, his voice measured but laced with quiet condescension. "Ms. Mitchell, I trust you understand the seriousness of these proceedings," he said, already assuming she did not. A few soft chuckles rippled through the gallery. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded once, her expression calm, her eyes steady, as if she had already heard far worse. That silence, calculated, composed, irritated him more than defiance ever could. He leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against the bench. "Or perhaps," he added, louder now, "this is your first time in a courtroom of this caliber." More laughter, sharper this time. The air shifted. Sarah remained still. No flinch, no apology. Just that same quiet gaze that seemed to absorb everything without giving anything back. To Whitmore, it looked like weakness. To anyone paying closer attention, it felt like restraint. He continued, pushing further, turning her into a spectacle for the room. "Let's keep this simple," he said. "Answer clearly. Try to keep up." The words landed exactly as intended, drawing attention, reinforcing hierarchy, reminding everyone who held power. But something subtle changed in the room. A clerk paused mid-note. A junior attorney shifted in his seat. There was a flicker, small, almost invisible, but real. Sarah finally spoke, her voice soft but unmistakably precise. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor." No hesitation. No tremor. Just clarity. Whitmore smirked, interpreting composure as compliance. He didn't notice the way her fingers rested lightly on the folder, not gripping it, but controlling it, like someone accustomed to holding something far heavier than paper. He didn't notice the way her eyes briefly scanned the bench, not nervously, but methodically, as if mapping every angle of the room. And he certainly didn't notice the quiet shift happening beneath the surface. The moment where a woman who appeared ordinary chose not to defend herself. Yet. Because this wasn't fear. It was timing. And as the judge leaned back, satisfied with the impression he had created, the room settled into a fragile stillness, unaware that the balance of power had already begun to tilt in a direction none of them were prepared for. The first mistake had been made, and it belonged entirely to him. Judge Whitmore flipped through the file with exaggerated slowness, the faint rustle of paper echoing across the room like a deliberate performance, and every second he delayed felt less about procedure and more about control, as if he were reminding everyone present that time itself belonged to him. Then without looking up he spoke again, his tone sharper now. "Ms. Mitchell, let us clarify something before we waste any more of this court's time." And that word waste lingered in the air like a quiet insult aimed directly at her existence in that room. A few heads in the gallery tilted forward, anticipation building. People always leaned in when power decided to press down harder. Sarah remained where she stood, shoulders relaxed, posture balanced, not defensive, not submissive, simply still, and that stillness began to feel heavier than any argument. Whitmore finally raised his eyes and fixed them on her with a thin smile that did not reach his face. "You are representing yourself today, correct?" he asked, though the answer was already written clearly in front of him. It was not a question, it was a setup. Sarah nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor," her voice calm, measured, precise in a way that did not match the role he had assigned to her. He leaned back slightly, as if settling into something he intended to enjoy. "No formal counsel, no legal representation, just you," he continued, emphasizing each word carefully. "That is a bold choice." The word bold carried a subtle edge, the kind that could easily be mistaken for admiration, but was in fact something closer to mockery. A murmur moved through the room again, quieter this time, more curious than amused. Sarah did not respond immediately. She let the silence sit, not as hesitation, but as space, controlled and intentional, and for a brief moment. It disrupted the rhythm Whitmore had been orchestrating. He tapped his pen again, faster now, a small sign of irritation slipping through his otherwise composed exterior. I assume, he pressed on, you understand the complexity of the matter before you. Sarah's eyes met his without resistance. I do, she said, simple, direct, without embellishment. And something about the way she said it caused the court reporter to pause for half a second before continuing to type. Whitmore's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward again, closing the distance with his voice. Then perhaps you would like to explain to this court, he said, now projecting so the entire room could hear every word clearly. On what basis you believe you are qualified to challenge the findings already established. There it was, the trap fully formed, not just a question, but a public invitation to fail, the kind that forced a person either to retreat or expose themselves. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged quick glances. Sensing the shift, Sarah lowered her gaze briefly to the folder in her hands, not in defeat, but in calculation. Her fingers moved across the edge of the paper as if aligning something unseen, and when she looked up again, there was a subtle change, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could point to directly, but enough to make the room feel slightly smaller, more focused. With respect, Your Honor, she began, her tone steady, carrying just enough weight to quiet the lingering whispers. The basis is already within the record. A few heads turned. Whitmore's pen stopped tapping, just for a moment. I am simply here to ensure it is recognized correctly. The words were careful, controlled, and for the first time, the balance shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone to fully understand, but enough that the silence that followed no longer belonged entirely to him. The words settled into the room with an unexpected weight, not loud, not dramatic, but precise enough to shift attention in a way Judge Whitmore had not anticipated. His fingers tightened slightly around the pen as he studied her more carefully now, no longer glancing but observing, measuring, trying to understand why a simple statement had disrupted the rhythm he controlled so easily. Recognized correctly, he repeated, his tone slower this time, testing the phrase as if it might reveal something hidden beneath it. A faint murmur moved through the gallery again, but it was different now, quieter, more focused, curiosity replacing amusement. Sarah did not move, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she stood, not imposed, not performed, simply present. Whitmore leaned forward again, attempting to reassert the dynamic. Then by all means, Ms. Mitchell, he said, gesturing lightly with his pen toward the documents before her. Please enlighten this court. The invitation was sharp, edged with expectation, a silent assumption that whatever she offered would fall short, that it would confirm the judgment he had already made. Sarah lowered her eyes briefly, opening the folder with careful precision. The soft sound of paper unfolding carried farther than it should have in the stillness. She scanned a page for only a moment before speaking again. Page 14, Your Honor, she said calmly, her voice steady enough that even the court reporter adjusted her posture slightly, preparing to capture every word. Whitmore did not immediately look. Instead, he held her gaze for a second longer, as if refusing to follow her lead. But then, almost reluctantly, his eyes dropped to the document, his expression neutral at first, then tightening just slightly as he found the section she had referenced. Sarah continued without raising her voice. The sequence of filings shows a discrepancy in the timeline, she explained, each word measured, deliberate, specifically between the submitted affidavit and the recorded acknowledgement. A few attorneys in the gallery leaned forward now, their interest no longer casual. Whitmore's pen stopped moving entirely, his eyes tracing the lines more carefully. That discrepancy, Sarah added, directly affects the validity of the conclusion that was drawn. The room held its breath, not dramatically, but subtly, as if something important had just entered the space and no one wanted to disturb it. Whitmore straightened slightly, closing the file halfway as he looked back at her, his expression controlled but no longer dismissive. You are suggesting an error in the record, he said, his tone flatter now, stripped of its earlier mockery. Sarah met his gaze without hesitation. I am pointing out what is already there, she replied, simple, unembellished, and for a brief moment, the balance shifted again. Not enough to overturn anything yet, but enough to create tension where certainty had once lived. One of the junior clerks exchanged a quick glance with a colleague, and even the faint scratching of pens in the gallery slowed as attention narrowed. Whitmore adjusted his robe, a subtle movement, but one that carried the faintest hint of recalibration. He flipped the page back open, scanning again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if searching not just for the detail she had mentioned, but for something else entirely. Something that would restore the control he felt slipping in. Small, almost imperceptible increments. Sarah remained still, her hands resting lightly against the folder, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged, but the room no longer saw her the same way. The quiet woman who had entered unnoticed was no longer invisible, and the silence that followed no longer belonged to power alone. It belonged to possibility. Judge Whitmore did not speak immediately this time, and that hesitation, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. The courtroom air tightening as his eyes moved once more across the document, slower now, more deliberate, as though each line carried weight he had not accounted for. He cleared his throat quietly, a small sound that echoed louder than expected in the stillness, then placed the file down with controlled precision. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his tone measured, stripped of its earlier ease. "This court does not operate on isolated interpretations." The words were firm, but there was something beneath them now, something less certain. Sarah remained still, her expression unchanged, but her presence had shifted from passive to anchored, as if she now stood on ground that could not be moved. Whitmore continued, leaning slightly forward. "Context matters, sequence matters, and more importantly, intent matters." He emphasized the last word, attempting to rebuild authority through complexity, a familiar tactic, but Sarah did not react. She simply listened, allowing him to finish, and in that silence, the balance of control slipped just a fraction further. "Of course," she replied calmly when he paused, her voice steady and respectful. "And that is exactly why the sequence is critical." She gestured lightly toward the file, not dramatically, not challengingly, just enough to guide attention. Because intent cannot be properly established when the timeline itself is inconsistent. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was sharp. A quiet ripple moved through the gallery again, this time unmistakably attentive. Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly. He picked up the file again, flipping back to the page she had referenced, then forward, then back again, as if searching for something he might have missed. The motion was controlled, but no longer effortless. One of the senior attorneys in the back row leaned toward a colleague, whispering something under his breath, their eyes no longer dismissive, now analytical. Sarah continued, her tone unchanged. "The acknowledgement was recorded at 9:42 in the morning," she said, her voice clear enough to carry without strain. "But the affidavit it references was not officially submitted until 11:15. She paused just long enough for the numbers to settle, not as a dramatic beat, but as a factual one. That gap creates a procedural inconsistency that affects the foundation of the ruling. The room went quiet, not abruptly, but gradually, like a sound fading out rather than stopping. Whitmore looked up again, his expression controlled but no longer dismissive. There was a flicker there now, something closer to calculation than confidence. "Clerical delays are not uncommon," he responded, his voice firmer, as if reclaiming ground. "And they do not necessarily invalidate a conclusion." Sarah nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. "That would be true," she said, "if the acknowledgement had not explicitly cited the affidavit as already verified at the time." She held his gaze, not aggressively, but steadily, which would require it to exist in the record before it was submitted. The distinction was precise, and it landed. Whitmore's pen tapped once against the bench, then stopped. He did not immediately respond. Instead, his eyes returned to the document again, slower now, more careful, as if the page itself might shift under closer scrutiny. The court reporter paused for half a second, then resumed typing, capturing every word with heightened attention. Sarah remained exactly where she was, unmoving, composed, her hands resting lightly against the folder. But the weight of the room had shifted toward her, not dramatically, not completely, but undeniably. And as the silence stretched just a moment longer than it should have, It became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a simple exchange. Something deeper had begun to unravel, and for the first time that morning, Judge Whitmore was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath his own authority. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not for Sarah, but for the man who had once controlled every second of it. Judge Whitmore adjusted his posture again, a subtle shift, but this time it carried something unfamiliar, restraint. His fingers rested on the edge of the bench instead of tapping, as if even the smallest sound might betray the change happening beneath his composed exterior. He inhaled slowly before speaking. "Even if there is a discrepancy," he said, choosing each word more carefully now, "it does not automatically negate the conclusion drawn from the totality of the evidence." The statement was firm, but it lacked the sharp edge it once carried. It sounded less like authority and more like defense. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression steady, her presence unchanged, but there was a quiet awareness in her eyes now, as if she had anticipated this exact response long before she stepped into the room. "Of course," she replied softly, her tone respectful but unwavering. "But when the foundation of that evidence relies on a sequence that cannot logically exist, the conclusion becomes dependent on an assumption rather than a verified fact." Her words were not louder, not forceful, yet they carried farther than anything that had been said before. One of the attorneys in the gallery leaned back slowly, folding his arms as he watched more intently, no longer casual, no longer entertained, now fully engaged. Whitmore's gaze sharpened, not in dominance, but in focus. He flipped through the pages again, faster this time, searching, recalculating his mind, moving through possibilities he had not considered minutes ago. The courtroom remained still, the quiet no longer passive. It was expectant, waiting. Sarah continued, not rushing, not pressing, simply guiding. "If the acknowledgement references verification that had not yet occurred," she said, "then either the timeline is incorrect or the verification was assumed without proper basis." She paused briefly, allowing the distinction to settle. "And either scenario affects the integrity of the ruling." The word integrity lingered in the air, not as an accusation, but as a weight that could not be ignored. Whitmore closed the file slowly this time, his movements deliberate, controlled, but undeniably different. He looked at her again, truly looked, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the role he had assigned to her at the beginning of the hearing. "You speak with a level of familiarity that suggests more than casual understanding," he said, his tone quieter now. Stripped of its earlier performance, Sarah did not immediately answer. She allowed a brief silence to exist, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement. Then she responded, "I speak based on what is present in the record," her voice calm, her words precise, offering nothing beyond what was necessary, and somehow that made it more powerful. Whitmore exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, the authority of the bench still beneath him, but the certainty no longer as solid as it had been. A faint shift moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens when perception begins to change. The court reporter's typing slowed slightly, each keystroke more deliberate, as if capturing something more significant than routine proceedings. Sarah remained still, her hands resting lightly against the folder, but the energy around her had changed, no longer the quiet presence overlooked at the beginning. Now she stood as the axis around which the room had begun to turn, and in that moment, without raising her voice, without stepping forward, without demanding attention, she had already begun to dismantle something far larger than a single argument. She had begun to unravel certainty itself, and the room, whether ready or not, was starting to realize it. Judge Whitmore remained silent longer than anyone in the room expected, his gaze fixed not on Sarah this time, but on the closed file resting beneath his hand, as if the answers he needed were no longer written on its pages, but somewhere just beyond his immediate reach. The authority he had carried so effortlessly at the beginning of the hearing now felt heavier, more deliberate, and for the first time, it required effort to maintain. He finally spoke, but his voice had changed, quieter, more controlled. "The court acknowledges the observation," he said, each word measured carefully, no longer designed to dominate but to stabilize, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed. Sarah inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. the kind that comes from understanding exactly where the moment stands. Whitmore continued. However, identifying a discrepancy is not the same as establishing its impact. He paused briefly, as if weighing his next words more cautiously than before. The burden remains on you to demonstrate that this inconsistency materially alters the outcome. The statement was precise, legally sound, but it lacked the earlier confidence that had framed his authority. Now it sounded more like a line drawn carefully rather than one declared with certainty. Sarah did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to return, not as a void, but as space, controlled and intentional. Her fingers rested lightly on the folder before she opened it again, this time slower, as if every movement carried purpose beyond the action itself. The faint sound of paper shifting once again echoed across the room, and with it, attention sharpened. She glanced down briefly, then lifted her eyes back to the bench. Then, with the court's permission, she said, her tone steady, respectful, yet unmistakably confident, I would like to address the impact directly. Whitmore hesitated for a fraction of a second, not enough for most to notice, but enough to exist. Then he gave a slight nod. Proceed, he said, the words simple, but now carrying a different weight, not a command, but an allowance. Sarah stepped forward just slightly, no more than a few inches, yet the shift in position altered the dynamic of the room in a way that could not be ignored. She placed a single document on the table before her, aligning it carefully, not hurried, not hesitant, simply precise. The ruling, she began, her voice clear and controlled, relies on the assumption that the affidavit was verified prior to acknowledgement. She paused just long enough for the statement to settle. That assumption forms the basis for accepting its contents as valid at the time the decision was made. A few heads in the gallery nodded almost imperceptibly, following the logic as it unfolded. Whitmore's eyes moved from her to the document, then back again, his attention no longer divided. Now fully engaged, Sarah continued. If that sequence is not accurate, then the verification did not exist when it was cited. Her tone remained even, but the clarity of her words carried increasing weight, which means the conclusion was built on information that had not yet been established in the record. The room grew quieter, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tightening focus that excluded everything else. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his hand resting near the file, but he did not reach for it this time. He simply listened. Sarah's gaze remained steady, not challenging, not yielding, just present. And when a conclusion depends on a premise that does not exist at the time it is used, she said softly, the integrity of that conclusion cannot remain intact. The words settled into the space between them, not as an attack, but as a truth that required acknowledgement. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the faint sounds that usually filled the background had faded, and in that stillness, something shifted again, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. The authority in the room had not disappeared, but it had changed hands in a way no one had anticipated. And for the first time since the hearing began, Judge Whitmore was no longer leading the moment. He was responding to it. The silence did not break immediately, and in that silence something deeper settled into the room. Not uncertainty anymore, but recognition. Judge Whitmore remained still for a moment, his eyes fixed on Sarah, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the role she had quietly dismantled piece by piece. His hand moved slowly toward the file again, but this time there was no urgency in the motion, only deliberation. He opened it once more, scanning the pages not to challenge her words, but to confirm them, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed by anyone present. The authority he once projected outward had turned inward, now directed at understanding rather than asserting. You are presenting a structural flaw, he said finally, his voice measured, lower than before, stripped of performance. Sarah did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist on its own, giving it weight, giving it space. Then she nodded once. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her tone calm, unwavering. A structural flaw that affects the validity of the process, not just the outcome. Her words were precise, and they landed with quiet finality. A few attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances again, but this time there was no amusement, only acknowledgement. Whitmore leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench. No tapping, no restless movement, just stillness, as if the room itself had slowed to match the gravity of the moment. He exhaled softly, the sound barely audible, but in the silence it carried. "And your position," he continued, choosing each word carefully, "is that the ruling cannot stand as issued." Sarah met his gaze without hesitation. "My position is that the ruling relies on a premise that was not established at the time it was used," she said, her voice steady, not louder, not sharper, simply clear. "And without that premise, the conclusion cannot remain intact." The words did not challenge, they clarified, and in doing so they removed the need for argument entirely. The courtroom remained still, no shifting, no whispering, just the quiet presence of something undeniable. Whitmore closed the file slowly, his expression composed, but no longer guarded in the same way. There was something else there now, something closer to realization than resistance. He looked at her again, longer this time, not as a figure to control, but as a presence to understand. "You have a remarkable command of procedural detail," he said, his tone neutral, but no longer dismissive. Sarah did not react to the observation. She simply stood as she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged, and yet everything around her had shifted. Whitmore's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he glanced briefly toward the clerk, then back to Sarah, as if recalibrating the entire structure of the proceeding in real time. The balance had not collapsed, but it had undeniably moved, and everyone in the room could feel it, not as a dramatic turn, but as a quiet certainty settling into place, the kind that does not announce itself but cannot be ignored. Sarah remained still, her hands resting lightly against the folder, her posture steady, her expression calm. But there was no longer any doubt in the room about what had happened. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded attention, she had not stepped outside the bounds of respect or procedure, and yet she had shifted the entire weight of the courtroom without force, without spectacle, without anything but precision and restraint. And as the silence held just a moment longer, it became clear that the next move no longer belonged to the man behind the bench. It belonged to the truth that had just been placed before him. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, not as tension anymore, but as something heavier, something final. Judge Whitmore did not rush to respond, and that alone marked a shift that everyone in the room could feel. He looked down at the file once more, then slowly closed it, not with authority, but with acceptance, his fingers resting on the cover as if acknowledging that what lay inside no longer held the certainty it once did. He lifted his gaze towards Sarah again, and this time there was no trace of dismissal, no trace of condescension, only focus, measured and deliberate. "The court will take a brief recess," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but quieter than before, and the words carried differently now, not as a command to maintain order, but as a necessity to regain it. A subtle murmur moved through the gallery as people shifted in their seats, the sound restrained, respectful, but filled with quiet realization. Sarah did not move. She did not relax. She simply remained where she stood, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had already anticipated this pause long before it was spoken. The bailiff announced the recess, and chairs moved softly against the polished floor as people began to stand. But even as the room stirred, the attention did not fully leave her. Glances lingered, subtle, curious, no longer dismissive. Whitmore stepped down from the bench with measured steps, his robes settling around him as he moved toward the side chamber. But just before he disappeared behind the door, he paused for the briefest moment, his eyes shifting back toward Sarah. Not long, not obvious, but enough to register, enough to acknowledge that something had changed in a way he could not ignore. The door closed quietly behind him, and for a moment, the courtroom remained in a strange in-between state, no longer formal, but not relaxed either. A space where perception was being recalibrated in real time. One of the junior attorneys leaned toward another, whispering something too low to be heard, but the tone carried a different kind of respect now, the kind that replaces assumption when it is proven wrong. Sarah slowly gathered her documents, her movements unhurried, precise, not a single motion wasted. She placed the folder back together, aligning the edges carefully. As if the order she maintained in her hands reflected the clarity she had brought into the room, she did not look around. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply prepared, as though the moment had not been about winning anything, but about restoring something that had been overlooked across the room. The court reporter paused, her fingers resting lightly above the keys, her eyes following Sarah for a second longer than necessary, then returning to her screen, as if processing more than just words. Minutes passed quietly, and when the side door finally opened again, the room stilled almost instantly, the subtle sounds fading back into silence as Judge Whitmore returned to the bench, his expression composed, but different. The sharp edges softened into something more measured, more deliberate. He took his seat slowly, adjusting his robe once, then placing his hands on the bench with quiet intention. His eyes moved across the room briefly before settling once again on Sarah, and in that moment, without a single word spoken yet, it became clear to everyone present that the authority in the room had not disappeared, but it had changed form, no longer unquestioned, no longer absolute. Now it existed within the boundaries of something far more demanding, something that required acknowledgement, and as the silence settled once more, deeper than before, the next words he would speak no longer carried the same certainty they once did, because now they had to answer to something greater than position. They had to answer to truth. The courtroom settled into complete silence as Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his hands resting firmly on the bench, his posture composed, but no longer carrying the effortless dominance it once did. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. After reviewing the record and considering the arguments presented, he began, each word deliberate, measured. This court finds that the inconsistency in the timeline raises a material concern regarding the validity of the prior conclusion. A subtle ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, not disruptive, but undeniable. The kind of reaction that comes when expectation quietly shifts into realization. Sarah remained still, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as if the words did not surprise her, but simply confirmed what she had already understood. Whitmore continued, his gaze lowering briefly to the file before returning to her. A ruling must stand on a foundation that is both procedurally and factually sound, he said, his tone no longer asserting control, but acknowledging responsibility. And in this instance, that foundation has been called into question. He paused for a moment, the silence deepening as every person in the room listened. Therefore, the court will set aside the prior ruling pending further review. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. The balance had shifted fully now, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity. A clerk inhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, while one of the attorneys in the back lowered his gaze, as if reconsidering something he had assumed earlier. Whitmore leaned back slightly, his expression composed, but something in his eyes had changed. Something quieter, more reflective. He looked at Sarah again, not as an opponent, not as a disruption, but as a presence that had revealed something essential. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice even, but stripped of all earlier condescension, "this court acknowledges the precision of your argument." There was no embellishment in the statement, no unnecessary praise, just recognition, and in that simplicity, it carried more weight than anything he had said before. Sarah gave a small, respectful nod, nothing more. She did not step forward. She did not speak. She simply stood as she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, unchanged, and yet everything around her had transformed. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of hierarchy. It was the silence of understanding. Whitmore gathered the file slowly, aligning its edges with care before placing it aside, his movements deliberate, controlled, as if each action now required intention rather than assumption. "This matter is adjourned," he said finally, and as the gavel came down softly, it did not echo with authority the way it had at the start of the hearing. It resonated differently, as a conclusion shaped by something greater than position. Chairs moved quietly as people began to stand, but no one rushed. The energy in the room had changed, softened, grounded. A few glances lingered on Sarah as she collected her documents, not curious anymore, not dismissive, but respectful in a way that did not need to be spoken. She closed her folder with the same calm precision, her hands steady, her movements unhurried. And without drawing attention, she turned and walked toward the exit, her steps quiet against the polished floor, no announcement, no acknowledgement, just presence. And as she reached the doors, the room remained still for a moment longer than necessary, as if something unspoken had settled into the space she left behind, something that would remain long after the case itself was forgotten, because that day was never about a single ruling. It was about the moment when authority met truth and was forced to listen. And in that quiet intersection, the room had witnessed what dignity truly looks like.